So you guys must have been pretty upset when Rick Smalley.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, he was actually here last year.
No, I thought he was really active and vigorous. I was really surprised when that happened.
I've heard for a while he was sick.
Somebody was asking me just yesterday, who can we get who's a Nobel Prize winner who's in touch with reality on these issues? And I said, oh, not this week. Can't do that. Is there anybody else? Actually, no. I don't know anyone else who fits that niche.
Taking the science and convincing people to do something for that.
He had a sincere concern for world problems. And there are very few. I certainly don't know any Nobel Prize winners in that category. Jury may know. I don't know. I did jury. I was at one of her seminars many years ago, and I still remember some things from the world. Although it's ironic, I did more to raise my level of than anybody else I've heard of all of the nanotechnologies and energy, the one that strikes me the most immediately interesting is nanoparticle batteries. But the plan for getting that stuff all the way to the market is right now very, very sketchy. The pipeline between the companies doing research and the open market. I'm thinking of doing a workshop that might help a little bit, but it turns out part of the problem is that China is running out of manufacturing technology. What? We may hold a U.S.-China workshop if we can do all the logistics correctly.
Well, we're actually delivering
Testing 1, 2. One, two.
We'd like to get started in a second, so if people can grab the last cookie out there, coffee, we'll get going. Well, welcome. My name's Dave Brzeski. I direct the Foresight and Governance Project here at the Wilson Center, and I also direct something called a Project on Emerging Nanotechnologies, which is a partnerships with the Pew Charitable Trust. I'd like to welcome you all to the Wilson Center. For those of you who don't know much about the center, it was set up in 1968 as a living monument to Woodrow Wilson. It was designed to essentially embody his desire and belief that it made sense to bring academics together with policymakers, that good policy would come out of that. I just was upstairs. I've got to testify before the Congress on Thursday, and I have to finish my testimony in about an hour. But I was actually reading through the section of the 2000 State of the Future report on nanotechnology. My involvement with Jerry and the report goes back actually a long way, about 14 years. I was at the Environmental Protection Agency in the late 80s, and I actually headed up something called the Future Studies Unit that was in the policy office. And while I was there, I was always looking around for good futures research. And there were sort of 3 or 4 things that I wanted to find, and I really had a hard time finding on the bookshelf. I wanted something that essentially was built on a robust methodology. I was interested in something that was repetitive. I wanted people to be sort of telling me on a yearly basis or biannual basis what's happened to the sort of trends or the things that are shaping the world I lived in, and should I be looking at anything else. I wanted something that was international in scope, and again, the last thing, sort of the last criteria, was something that was policy relevant, that I could actually use because I was in a policy-making environment. I wasn't just doing analysis. I came upon an idea that was floated by Jerry and Ted Gordon to start essentially sort of the methodology and the background that grew into the State of the Future report, the Millennium Project. And I convinced the people at EPA to actually put some money into it. This was in 1992. At that point in time, the U.S. government had never funded anything at the United Nations University. So that was a first. And so the EPA actually funded the feasibility study for the Millennium Project. And out of the Millennium Project grew the State of the Future report and, I'd say dozens of other projects that Jerry and Ted and his colleagues have done over the last decade or so. So it's really a pleasure for me to sort of be here, welcome Jerry back to the center, and let him talk about what he's done this year, what he hopes to do next year. And we're being joined by Paul Verbos from the National Science Foundation. So Paul is going to say a few words, but I'll turn it over to Jerry.
Thank you, Dave, and good luck with Congress. Hopefully it'll be okay for you. I asked also Paul Verbos to come because he's also, like Dave, a member of our planning committee. We've got a board of directors of about 30 or 40 people, and we got 2 of them here in Washington, D.C., and here they are. So Paul has used the Millennium Project in sort of a unique way, and I thought we'd share that with you so that as you're listening to the talk now, you can think about how you might apply it in a different way within your own organization.
Thank you, Jerry. And of course, there are all those missing members of the Planning Committee in Brazil and in China that really provide the life of this activity in many ways. But I promised Jerry I would only talk my one little story. Back around 2001, 2002, Jerry was doing one of the special studies that tends to feed into the State of the Future, one on science policy. And one of the questions they asked science policy people all around the world was, what was the one single thing that science and technology could do that would greatest benefit the future of humanity? And the number one answer people cited around the world was a non-fossil, non-nuclear source of affordable baseload electricity. And that was very interesting because at about that time, we started discussions with NASA about whether we should start a funding initiative in a very high-risk area, at least it was high-risk in those days, involving space solar power. And there were lots of space enthusiasts and defense types who thought it would be a great idea, but we have a very international community. And the input from the State of the Future was absolutely crucial. When we issued the announcement to universities around the country, we quoted the Millennium Project and the State of the Future as one of about 5 things people should read if they wanted to have a good background on what we're really trying to do here in this area of advanced research. And so it played a pivotal role. It was really just one question, but the right question can play a pivotal role. And that's all I should say right now. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon. I hope everybody's had a good meal and not too much that you fall asleep in the middle of this. If there's something that's burning on your mind in the middle of the talk, raise your hand, bring it up right then and there. Don't worry, stand on protocol. The Millennium Project, as I mentioned, Dave mentioned, had started with a feasibility study in '92. We did a 3-year feasibility study. The entire UN did not have a 3-year feasibility study. This is a complex project. It has to do with trust and sharing of things around the world, and that takes a while to build up. And we began operations in '96, and this is our 9th State of the Future report, and only the 2nd time we've actually had a book launch in Washington, D.C. The first one was '97, and this is the next one. We're a little bit behind in our public relations, so we're happy to catch up with that. This is the table of contents for the current one. I would like to say, though, that maybe on the streaming video, Ted Gordon, my partner in crime, is watching up in Connecticut. Ted Gordon, for those of you who don't know, was part of the original RAND Corporation team that developed Delphi and a lot of other sort of interesting methodological stuff. And before that, he was part of the team, or the head of the team that gave you the 3rd stage of the Apollo rocket. So when people say it doesn't take rocket science, the answer is yes, it does. We have our own rocket science. So hello, Ted, if you're there. The executive summary, in a sense, is an executive summary of executive summaries. As you'll note on that previous slide, the book itself, which I don't have in front of me, here's the Chinese version anyway. The book itself is about a little under 100 pages. And then in the back, we put these CD-ROMs that's got 3,800 pages. So in a sense, the book is trying to address a contradiction that the future's Herman Kahn was always befuddled by. And that was, how do you put together futures research, information for a policymaker who wants the least amount of information possible to make the right decision, and at the same time show that you have considered absolutely everything in an academic environment and you're methodologically pure. These are 2 different assignments. So what we do is the CD-ROM is for those that want everything, 3,800 pages, and the print is for the people who want the short version. So the executive summary of that is an executive summary of all of that sort of stuff. So I sweat bullets over this executive summary, and you can get it on the website, download it, at least that part, at no charge. I'd like you to read that. We labored over that one very hard. We think it's a good summary. Chapter 1 of all of our State of the Futures reports is the update and accumulative wisdom that Dave Rajewski was referring to. We do 15 global challenges in there, and we update and improve them. The new data, new insights, change something that's wrong. And in the CD, we've got the details. So in the book, it's about 2 pages per challenge. So that's 30 pages for 15 challenges. In the CD, it's about 597 pages. So that's your compression ratio. The second chapter is another innovation. It's called the State of the Future Index. We don't claim this as a policy tool at the moment in the sense that countries should base it yet. It's still experimental, and we are working with some countries on integrating into their policy process. But the idea is, if the future is better in 10 years, what did that mean? Did it mean more cars? Did it mean more money? Did it mean fewer baby deaths? What does it really mean? So we do this global assessment, like Paul was mentioning before. So we get all this information together to say, what do we, the human beings, mean when we say we, the collective we, humanity, is better in 10 years? What does that mean? So we create a bunch of indicators, came up with some interesting mathematics to integrate it into an index, and that is presented each year in Chapter 2. One of the things that we did this past year was we reviewed of all of our State of the Future indexes over the last 5 years, and we found out something. History changes. We presented this to one of our planning committee meeting, and the chairman of the Gulf goes, wait a minute, history can't change. That doesn't make sense. You didn't do it right.
The Taoists loved it.
Well, the thing was that governments come and go. They don't like the data of a previous administration, and they change it. So one of the things that we've done with the State of the Future Index, we go back 20 years of data and then out 10. When we go back, so every time we update it, we have to go back to the last 20 years every time. So it's not like we're adding, like other indexes, another year on it and another year on it. We have to redo it every time because those definitions change in political, and there's actually a section in the CD-ROM that explains what changed and why it changed, and it's pretty enlightening. Politics and data. Chapter 3 takes the State of the Future Index and does it for about 10 Latin American, North American countries. I am hoping that the World Bank may take this on. We've begun some initial conversations. But to put the State of the Future Index in countries, so that then, because you're trying to talk about how you leverage money for the overall country, not just education or not just health. How do you hit the whole country? What are the synergies and so forth? So this is beginning to move around. This is a contribution, by the way, of the Venezuelan Deloitte and Touche. They've had some problems in Venezuela. Deloitte and Touche didn't want to close down, so they had some extra talent. They figured, well, let's put them to use. So this was actually like an in-kind contribution from Deloitte and Touche. Then this year we did a study on future ethical issues. An interesting insight in this chapter was that the statistical variation around the world geographically ain't that much of a big thing. And the statistical variation between men and women on the responses, not that big a thing either. Now, it could very well be that when you look far enough out, like do we have a right to clone ourselves, things like that, that there's not a sexual preference yet, because we haven't had the political spins and all the rest of that stuff going on. In the present tense, you certainly got those differences, but not so much in the far future. At least that's what we found. And the colleague said that give me all the data to do the analysis, and we'll give them that when I get back to the office. Nanotech, preventing the downside. One of the businesses of a futurist is to warn people about things so that we don't have to run into those bad problems. We've been doing environmental security work and research for the U.S. Army for a bunch of years. And in our analysis along the way, we said nanotech is going to become a big deal, and there's some potential downsides here. So why don't we be smart and figure out what our R&D requirements are to do it without the downside? For example, what happens if, for landmines, years ago, we had said, all right, the requirement is you have to be able to automatically turn it off somehow, or time delay, or some way that you can knock it out. Had we done that, there would have been literally millions of people walking around with legs today. So applying that to nanotech, we did an assessment on what should be their priorities, and that's gone into their system. 6, we do a monthly environmental security report. You can also get that on our website every month. And what we do is we identify things that have happened in the past month that relate to environmental security in some way, that might even lead into some treaty issues, so that people should think ahead of time about it. And then we summarize all that and analyze it in that chapter. And the details, full details, are in the CD. And then the Sustainable Development Index. Our node in the Central Europe, in Prague, took on the leadership to create better integrated sustainable development indices. I think that there are 7 major headings, and then 14 sub, and then 64 elements behind that. And if you compare that one with the other ones that you'll see, it's not too bad. It comes out well. And all the details, again, are in the CD. One of the things that we do with our nodes, and I'll come back to this a little bit later on, our nodes are individuals and organizations so far in a geographic location. We do have one in cyberspace, but that's the exception. But the idea is, how do you pick the best brains and minds and a good cross-section of people? Well, our theory to that is you use nodes, and they pick them. Now, when I say node, I mean it in sort of like an information approach, where where two or more networks intersect. Where they intersect, that's a node. All right? So when we do this in our think tank, it's like somebody from the universities, somebody, 1 or 2 from university, 1 or 2 from government, 1 or 2 from NGOs, 1 or 2 from international organizations that happen to be in the area, 1 or 2 from businesses, maybe 1 or 2 because they're just hot shots in the country and you just got to have them. So then when the question comes up, like who should answer the questionnaire in your country or be interviewed in your country about the future of energy, who are they? Well, in that cross-section, they can identify them. So it's not pure sociology, you understand. Futures research, in my view, although I am a minority on this, is not a science. To me, you're applying knowledge with skill. And if you had 2 teams, this was done years ago for 1969 or 70, funded by then the Office of Education. They had 2 different teams, one West Coast, one East Coast. They had the same data, same methodology, and they came out with different stuff, right? So this is not pure science. In any case, our approach to it is using these nodes. Now, one of the things we tell these nodes to do is if you create some energy, some activity, some interest in your area, go ahead and you take on that leadership. So each of our nodes can be headquarters for something. So imagine like a soccer ball or a football with little dots around it. Each dot can be a headquarters for different things, which then gives you a volume of activity that's a little bit hard to summarize in this program. Any case, so the Sustainable Development Index actually was created and initiated by our note in Central Europe, but they can draw on the whole project to do that. And then the CD-ROM, as I mentioned. I won't read the whole thing. This is CD-ROM stuff, but just to give you a little flavor for it, it's all of our previous research and all of the background questionnaires and the data. So if anybody wants to cross-reference anything, it's totally transparent. And then a whole lot of appendices. So to make a long story short, it's in there. Some highlights, at least highlights that struck me. One is organized crime is more than twice that of the military budgets worldwide. Now let that one sink in. It takes a while for the Defense Department, as they say, with a big aircraft carrier to turn around. Right? You can't make a decision in one day and change the whole deal. Organized crime may be able to do that. Secondly, organized crime, it is said, controls the price of cocaine and heroin on a global basis in thousands of markets. Now, if you're teaching an MBA course in management, and you had to make sure that your price was controlled in that many places, and then add on the problem that it's an illegal commodity, that's a one whopper management system. You know? That's one whopper management system. Now, I don't know any futures research organization, and I would like to be told I'm wrong on this, who has tried to take on organized crime as a whole system. You got people taking on drugs, you got people taking on prostitution, numbers, and so forth, and corruption. But this is a system. It's a large, complex set of systems that have to be countered. Because obviously, if you have military with half, and the military has some power in the world, imagine what organized crime has. And they can move faster. This is something that's got to be taken deadly seriously. And when I hear businesses say, well, look, young man, even though I might be older than they are, but anyway, look, young man, you don't understand. This is just a cost of business. That's a very dangerous attitude. As long as organized crime is a cost of business, it will grow. And then some people say, well, look, you know, you had your stuff in Chicago, you know, I mean, they matured, and, you know, it eventually worked out, they became legitimate. But you say, but there's a difference. When you're twice all the military budgets in the world, and you have the internet, and you have a jet plane, that's enough different that it's not the same game. We don't have time for this to mature out. Why? Because if we start to knock out certain other activities, where does that money start to go? Well, it's going to go into new product development like any smart business that controls markets around the world. Well, my guess is that it's going to go into buying and selling government decisions and anything related to government. And then they can start to leverage it. Just like you buy and sell heroin on a global basis, you can start to buy and sell decisions. Oh, you want France to do this? Well, here's the deal. I'll get Venezuela to do this, and you do this with Canada. Yes?
The one person I know who comes closest to doing that with crime is Rachel Ehrenfeld out of New York City.
Good. I'd like to be in touch with that right afterward. Thank you. Okay, another one is Internet is crashing along as usual. It's now up to about 1 billion people. It's 15% of the world. In my humble opinion, the forecasts about Internet have been woefully understated since the 1970s when I had my first email exchange. It was the early 70s. It was when President Nixon had his price and wage control thing. They had to control the price around the United States, and they were using email for that. It's moved on. The development gap is closing. You keep hearing people saying the development gap is getting wider, and I should say the digital gap is getting wider and wider. It's not. You look at it both ways. You can look at absolute numbers, the total number of first world versus third world. That ratio is changing and getting closer. And secondly, you can also look at the percent of penetration. So either way you analyze it, the digital gap is closing. And the faster it closes, the faster it'll be able to close. And one of the things that we have to understand is take advantage of opportunities. If we don't understand how fast the change is going, then we don't think that certain things are possible. And because we don't think certain things are possible, we don't make the decisions. We all know the Internet could have been around in the early 80s. Packet switching, I put them in some countries myself, in the early 80s. We could have had all that sort of stuff in process 20 years ago. The software was lagging a little bit, but nevertheless. 60%, according to the recent UN Millennium Assessment on the environment, 60% of the life support system is either gone or threatened. So in the terms of environmental security, we, humanity, are losing the war. And we have to act as if we're losing the war and get serious about it. 24/7 ubiquitous computing accelerates decision making. You know, if people start to joke about the cell phones, always interrupting. Well, what happens if you have them built into your body or on your body or in your, that you would be constantly having your agenda changed and someone else changing your agenda, you're changing their agenda, and then because you decide to go to this meeting, they can go to another. All day long you're making these little money decisions. I think we got to forecast ahead of time. That's going to drive us nuts. Now, having said that, there may be a new state for the human mind. When I was an NSF experimenter on EYES, computer communication system, we had a way. There was like this live chatting stuff you have today, but it was called 3 question mark interrupt. But anyway, I could do live interrupts to somebody else's computer and ask them a question, and maybe get that answer back 30 seconds later or a minute later. And then another live one to another person about something else, that I could put 2 or 3 accounts together and put one message out to 3 or 4 people. After a while, that gets very complex and confusing. But before God and Satan, there was a point where my mind went, it's okay. This is sort of like intellectual freeform jazz. And I got to a point where it was okay. Now, maybe we will get to that point where it's okay, but I don't know that. In any case, the idea of 24/7 ubiquitous computing in all things, all the time, that's a different state of mind than we have today. And I don't think we've come to grips with this yet. IQ becomes a competitive advantage. I don't care how you measure IQ, we want it to go up, not down. And if the infrastructure for the industrial competitive advantage was airports and laws and roads and things like that, what's the infrastructure for the intellectual economy? Well, obviously, part of it is brain functioning. So it would be very nice if ministries of education, including our own in the United States, decided that brain functioning, or IQ, was a thing to move toward as part of the objectives for education. Indochina, high-tech, low-tech wage, so you got high-tech and low wages, which you don't have in other countries, which means that the third world, where we're telling people to do some export-led development, sounds to me like it's doomed to failure. I don't know how you get around this. Some people have even estimated that China, by 2025, will be able to manufacture 25% of everything manufactured. Well, if you're another country and you're basing your future on getting your industries together for export-led growth, and you can't sell because China has undercut everything that you're trying to, it's not smart. So we got to rethink the whole concept of development economics research. In the environment, one of the things that, let me have one of those, who's got to say the future? I want to show somebody. Anyone got one nearby here? Want to pass one up for a second? I want to show you something. Okay, thank you. There's about 500 environmental agreements in the world. And that includes every 2-bit little one. I mean, the major ones, you're looking at 20 or so, or 30. But people talk about environmental consciousness, or raising consciousness. What does that mean in an empirical way? Well, on this State of the Future, we've got a little chart which is just delightful. Later on, maybe you can take a look at it. I don't know if you can zoom into this or not.
What page?
It's page 97. No, sorry, 87. What you can see from a distance, maybe all these little dots rising up. What these are referring to is a number of major environmental treaties, i.e. international ones, and the numbers of countries that are ratifying it. So this is actually a chart of rising global environmental consciousness. Implication here is what you thought you could get away with in the last 20 years, you will not be able to get away with in the next 20 years. And that hits all aspects of our civilization. Okay. One of the things that Dave Rajewski's opened up a new center for some of this sort of stuff is nanotechnology, health, and environmental impacts. In the last year, that is growing like crazy. When we started doing our study, or talking about doing that a couple of years ago, there was hardly anybody on the block at that time. Now it's crowded. Yes, sir?
Just a quick question. You say environmental life support systems, you're referring to nature?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Rivers, soil, if it works. Yeah. It's the thing that without it, we're dead. Unless we got an artificial spaceship we're leaving on.
And that's human life support as opposed to environmental life support.
The whole business, inclusive. Yeah, because nature needs some water for itself as well as humans.
Right.
Right.
The whole thing.
Yeah, the whole thing.
Just trying to understand the whole
Yeah, because if you don't have if nature itself isn't supporting its own systems, then we can't use them either.
Right.
Right. Okay. The future is going to be faster changing than most people think. If you think about the last 25 years, there was no cell phones, no PCs, no internet, no World Wide Web. NATO was not in Eastern Europe. There was no world. The European Union did not exist. There are no little rovers running around Mars taking photographs. Most of the audiences I talked to like this in the 70s thought that World War III was inevitable. that we wouldn't even be here alive. If you explained asymmetrical warfare in those days, they would say, that's a thing in the Bible called David and Goliath, but that doesn't relate to the real world. And it is very much the real world today. There was no AIDS 25 years ago. The virus may have been there, but at least it wasn't up in the pandemic stage. So here are major things that we talk about in newspapers on a daily basis that weren't around 25 years ago. And if they were said in a meeting like this, it would like, well, there goes one of those far-out futurists again. Well, the next 25 years, or even 15 years, we should have some major breakthroughs. This is where we ought to be thinking about how we go back to the business about taking advantage of opportunities. We did not take advantage of the opportunities of what we could do with internet early on. And certainly during the Cold War, it should have been done, you would think. Anyway, so the failure of imagination means that we lose opportunities. And that's one of the things you'll find throughout this book. We're trying to look at what opportunities we should be looking at. One of those studies that I mentioned was the future ethical issues. And there was tons of institutes studying ethics, so we didn't want to repeat that. And in the State of the Future is an annotated bibliography of organizations doing that. So if you want to get a good survey of the state of current ethical research, it's in the State of the Future. So we did that so we wouldn't reinvent the wheel. So we tried to come up with stuff, and we broke it up into time periods. And I won't go through the details on that, but by breaking it into time periods, asking people certain periods of time, it forces people to get out of the present tense a bit. Do we have the right to clone ourselves? Yes or no? It's certainly going to come up as an issue. Are you breaking the law? You have a right. Do parents have a right to create genetically altered designer babies and therefore permanently change the germline of that line of human beings forever? Do you have a right to do that? Should there be two standards for those who are technologically altered in some way and those who are not? You've heard the controversy over steroids. Well, steroids is like the little kite flying compared to like going off into space, what's coming up. So the idea of stopping people from enhancing themselves, I think, is a non-starter. Because even if the United States stops something and the UK stops something, Dominique in the Caribbean is going to say, bring your scientists down here. We'll do it. And it seems to me that mothers will want the best for their children. So if there's reasonably safe ways to increase brain functioning or IQ or whatever, they're going to go down to Dominique and have it done. So a lot of these issues, to me, it seems that they separate themselves out by saying, okay, you want to be natural, normal, whatever that means in a sense, fine. That's your baseball league, that's your school system, whatever it is. And that those who want to go the speed of light, charging ahead, maybe there's two different things. We may have to think about that. We do it with the Special Olympics. Will we eventually have two different baseball systems? Okay, some of the values underlying these issues, we asked people, would they change over time? What would be getting more pervasive around the world, and what would be getting less pervasive? There's about 400 people that we asked through the 25 nodes around the world who selected these people. And the panel rated which values are likely to increase and decrease around the world over the next 50 years. We try to give them a 50-year time frame just to break free from the present tense. It's not that you can obviously really know 50 years, but it's just the idea is to break free from your normal thinking. So those values that look like they are going to decrease over the next 50 years, according to the international panel of those 400 people selected by the 25 nodes, was that life is a divine, unalterable gift. So the idea of unalterable may be alterable in the future. Economic progress is the most reliable path to human happiness. Apparently that's going to decrease over the future. The family in all its forms is a foundation of social values, may be continuing to decrease. I say continuing because it's been a little decreasing anyway. Human rights should always prevail over the rights of other living and non-living things. Well, that's a decreasing value potentially. Values likely to increase over the next 50 years. Harmony with nature is more important than economic progress. Protection of the environment and biodiversity should be considered in any policy. The rights of women and children are uninfringible and fundamental to healthy society. World interest should prevail over nation-state interest. Big one right there. We'll see if that changes over 50 years. In a sense, the ISO, International Standards Organization, has 35,000 standards right now. And those are how we as a human family in the world are supposed to act together. So, and in international treaties with the UN. So in a sense, we are, moving in that direction clearly. Human space migration is part of human evolution. Any artificial life form intelligent enough to request rights should be given those rights. Where's Ike Asimov when I need him? He didn't have that one, but that's a nice one. If they're smart enough to ask for rights, they get them. Now, the 15 global challenges that we talk about came through a long, torturous process, and I will not torture you by going through that process. But that chart is simply to tell you that it came through a long, torturous process. Now, 15 global challenges. The first is sustainable development. We know that something like 3 to 3.5 billion tons of carbon is processed by nature. We're producing 7 billion right now. Clearly that's not sustainable. All the energy work that we've been recently looking at, people are assuming the fossil fuel continues without carbon sequestration. The fossil fuel can continue, but if you don't have the carbon sequestration, then the global warming increases. And I first wrote about global warming in 1973 for the Committee for the Future. I say that simply to say that I have monitored personally the estimates over all those years. And one thing I can share with you is that the estimates about what would happen in 85 and 2000 and so forth, those estimates have understated the situation, not overstated it as a generalization. Hence, we've got to take it more seriously than we have thought to take it seriously. Also, we've probably got another 2.7 billion people coming up in the world in the next 50 years. Those extra people, most likely, as an average, will be wealthier than today, because those means of production, like internet is being shared with the knowledge economy and all the various things and freeing up economies, usually lead to more income. Well, if that's the case, then over the next 50 years, those extra 2.7 billion aren't like the past 2.7 billion. They'll be consuming potentially more. How are we going to do that? How are we going to get enough animal protein? Animal protein goes up even in India when income goes up, in areas of vegetarian culture being reinforced. Now, if you take that seriously, where is the animal protein going to come from? Friends, what?
Plants.
Plants.
You're going to have to put the genes in plants and students.
That's why I said animal protein.
I understand.
But there is vegetable protein. That's what I'm saying. That's why I give you the example of India. India should answer the question, well, we'll have protein in our animal and our vegetable material. But the fact is, the animal protein consumption is going up. So, yes, if you can do it the vegetarian way, great. But in futures research, you've got to look at all the options. And you have to look at your contingency planning. Because if it doesn't work that way, what do you do?
Manufacture.
There's a lot of stuff to... Yes?
Manufacture it, create it.
Okay, how?
Well, I don't know, because I'm not a geneticist.
Okay, well, one way is, we're talking about stem cells to recreate brains or eyes and so forth. Why not take the stem cells out of the umbilical cord of a cow and just make the meat? Skip the cow. Cut out the middleman.
Exactly.
It's cheaper to use plants with the genes of animal meat to grow the protein.
I agree. And the deal is, can we make it work? How many times have good ideas not multiplied rapidly? But in any case, the main thing is we have to come to grips with exactly this issue. That's one answer. The other is another answer. But right now, you don't see the food industries, in my judgment, I haven't seen it yet, taking to grips that we have to completely change the protein requirement for the world. Yeah.
Yeah, the partial answer is that only 7% of the food waste in America is processed. And 50% of the waste that we have in weight and density is food waste. So if we produce animals and protein on the roof, and we take the waste from the restaurants and the homes and all of these government buildings and convert it into food, then we can handle it.
Okay, now good. What I'd like you to do is the mathematics on it. Do that.
Yeah.
But do the mathematics on it.
Yeah,
See how it adds up to a total picture.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the key point is Jerry is not predicting that things will be terrible.
Right.
What he's saying is that with existing trends, things could be terrible, and we have to think about the ways out. Just as you guys have been thinking about it in this room, we do a lot of thinking about it around the world, and then think about the possible solutions and who could implement them.
Yeah, take like water, the next challenge. Water tables are falling on all continents of the world. Right? Our node co-chair in China did the water scenarios, or led the water scenarios team for the World Water Forum on behalf of China. And in his best case scenario, to quote Herman Kahn, with good luck and good management, and I'd add a little rainfall, in his best case scenario for China, it continues to get worse for the next 15 years before it begins to turn around, which means you're not getting to where the terrible situation we are right now for 20 years. And you've got more people with more cars and more requirements. And you've already had forced migration in China. And I'm not talking about the Three Gorges Dam. I'm talking about forced migration because water isn't there. I mean, it's not there. You have to move. That's now. So we've got to really take seriously the water situation. And that's just China. India's got it too. I just have less information on India. But that's 40% of the world right there that could be unstable because of water. Population resources, I won't belabor that. I'll go through these quickly. Democratization, one of the issues we've got to do is how to learn how to deal with fail states. You know about that already. But we've got to get into the idea this country is part of the problem. We think too much of the trappings of democracy and not the culture of democracy. How do you change the culture of democracy? I'll never forget one person said to me very clearly, to make this clear, is that if you have a hole in the road, do you have a way to get it fixed? If you don't, you're not in democracy. Now, that's maybe an oversimplification, but how do you get the cultural democracy so there's a responsiveness to your government's responsiveness in the culture of the people, not simply voting systems that can be manipulated? Global long-term policy making. Obviously, that's most of you in this room. You don't need to know of that. Clearly, we've got to get that in the whole system. The globalization of information technology, how do you make it work for everyone? There's another 2 billion people that are in that $2 a day range. How do you get that part of the culture into the literacy revolution, the knowledge revolution, and all that sort of stuff? There are people working on that, but it's one of the great challenges of our day. The rich-poor gap. How do we address the rich-poor gap? You'll hear people say that's increasing and decreasing. If you take China and India out of the data, the gap is getting much wider. If you leave China and India in the data, then the gap is closing. I'm talking economic data here, not just the digital. Before I was talking about the digital divide. This is the economic, the cash divide. There's a lot of ways to address this, which the book talks about. Changing disease threats. You're very pleased to see that people are now taking avian flu seriously. SARS we were lucky on. We don't know how much luckier we can be on these sort of things. But we have to support, in my judgment, the World Health Organization when people says who needs the UN and all this sort of stuff. I don't believe you would be having as many airlines working today if it was not for the World Health Organization. Because the World Health Organization and with CDC and nation states and militaries cooperating together, SARS was closed down. It didn't have to be that way. And Canada was closed down for a couple of days already, but imagine that we did not have those international systems working. What would have happened? Now, fortunately, people are getting smart about the avian flu. There's a lot of attention being... So this is... The warnings are beginning to work in here. But we have to create global biological surveillance and detection and intervention systems, and we're just going to have to accept that. And if it infringes on some sovereignty, well, there's some trade-offs here. Peace and conflict. One of the issues that have come up in one of that science and technology study that Paul referred to, which was a bit upsetting, was that as power evolves from religion to the nation state to the corporation, and eventually the individual becomes more powerful, then that means that they can start to do those things that individuals couldn't do before, like declare war and use weapons of mass destruction. Extend out your trends in nanotechnology, biotechnology, chemistry, and simplification of putting kits together, and access to information. Sooner or later, somebody can decide to make a weapon of mass destruction and use it. Now, how do you create a security system that goes right down to the individual? So it seems to me we're going to have to think in terms of how do we get their education system, our mental health system, because I think it's the WACO more than any particular group that's going to do this, mental health system, and our security, policing, and military systems into some sort of relationship so that as a child grows up, they don't grow up to be a person to press the button. Now, that sounds hopelessly idealistic. But my friends, you got to tell me why it is not a realistic security threat in the future. One of the things that was an old plot in science fiction that I never took seriously was, why haven't the extraterrestrials shown up on planet Earth yet? And one answer was, well, because the technology to make that is so powerful that somebody goes wacko and messes up their own civilization. I said, oh, come on. Well, I don't say come on anymore. 11. 1 out of every 3 women, according to Amnesty International, will be attacked by their partner in the world. According to World Health, World Bank, and our own double-checking a little bit, there are more casualties at the hands of men to women than between nation states, ethnic conflicts, religious conflicts, civil wars. Now we have a large military establishment to protect ourselves from somebody coming over the border, or if the policing system doesn't breaks down. What do we have for women? There's not a defense system for women. And if it's true that that's the bigger challenge than the others, and if it's true that nation-state wars are decreasing, which they are, then what about the human security between men and women? This goes way beyond simply equal pay for equal work. How do we create a proper relationship between men and women in the world? And it's not just in any particular ethnic group. You can look around the world and you can see a lot of bad stuff going on, and it is not being addressed properly. I already mentioned a lot about organized crime and energy, science and technology, global ethics. One of the things that's emerging, that, as I mentioned earlier, you've got 35,000 international standards for all kinds of stuff. In a sense, very quietly, without much noticing to the press, we are creating a global ethical system in the ISOs. We're also creating them in these international UN treaties and so forth. And for the first time, I think, in history, in a large way, you're starting to have people do spiritual development, ethical evolution of their minds and spirits and behaviors and so forth, without necessarily being part of a particular club. You know, before you had to be a Buddhist or a Christian or something to do your spiritual evolution. Well, now people are sort of like doing free form more. New Age movement is an early example of this, but there's other kinds of movements that are going on. You've got tons of these religious, ethnic, ethical dialogues going on. But it seems to me that we have not in the past been able to be a real human family. You know, the jet plane wasn't around, the internet wasn't around. But now we're getting to a point that that's a reasonable thing to talk about. So it's a reasonable thing for the human family to talk about its ethical norms together. Big challenge. Now, in that State of the Future Index, remember I said you take all these various indicators and you say, okay, what makes it go up, what makes it goes down. So this is like a little report card on the future for the planet. This is where we're winning. GDP per capita is growing, the calories per capita is increasing, life expectancy is going up, literacy is growing up, infant mortality is dropped, access to water is increasing, even though there's a lot of problems coming up, but there's more people with access. Access to health care is improving, school enrollments are going up. Where we're losing is over here. So a nice thing about doing the State of the Future Index is you can show what is sensitive to the overall system, where you're winning and where you're losing, and where to put the best bucks in. Okay, environmental security, quickly go through this. When we define environmental security as environmental viability for life support. Just that simple. With 3 sub-elements, because this is a definition for the U.S. Army. First is preventing or repairing military damage to the environment. Second is preventing or responding to environmentally caused conflicts. And third is protecting the environment due to the moral value of the environment itself. And the government of Argentina, to my knowledge, is the first military to have that statement in its raison d'etre for its military. It's part of its job is to protect the environment. Okay, you don't have to read all this, but this is just to let you know that the U.S. is not leading in this area. Most of the treaties and activities and initiatives dealing with the environment and environmental security are actually coming out of Europe and the UN. Now, we also did a little study on nanotechnology, as I mentioned. It's a 2-round Delphi, and we asked what are the potential military uses and their possible health hazards and environmental impacts between now and 2010, and also between 2010 and 2025. So we listed those. You can get those in the book and all the statistics and what the breakdown was by country and so forth. And then what do we have to know to reduce or prevent these potential problems? And last, what are the general research priorities to produce the relevant knowledge to improve the future prospects of nanotech? So this goes into the Army as it's feeding into their system. Now, the Millennium Project is attempting to be a new kind of a think tank. It's something that it's global in its nature, but global not only geographically, but institutionally. We are as interested in dealing with businesses as we are with NGOs, as interested in dealing with universities as we are with governments, as interested in dealing with the UN systems as with individual hotshots. So we cut across all the institutions, because we know that these problems we face, the 15 challenges, are trans-institutional in their solution. No government or no system acting alone can really address these things. But we don't have the trans-institutional mechanisms yet. And we try to cut across the board disciplinarily, and the research focus, we try to look at the whole future. I've worked in futures research for about 35 years for left-wing, right-wing, up-wing, and down-wing think tanks. And it's always a problem because you want to look at the big picture, but the contract says look at the small picture. So one of the things that Ted Gordon and I sort of agreed to do early on is that we're going to look at the big picture. That's what we're going to do. So even if we have a very specific thing, like environmental security, whatever it is, we're going to look at it through the big picture. We're going to keep the big picture focused, because where else do you go for it? You know, if you go to the CIA, they're looking on behalf of the United States. If you go to the World Health Organization, they're looking on behalf of health. If you look at World Bank, they're looking on economics, etc. So how do you look at the whole picture on behalf of humanity? There wasn't anything around there. It still really isn't. And not that we're so great, but it's the only act so far in town that we know of. So we try to keep the research focus very broad, but detailed at the same time, which at first people said you can't do. Take organized crime. You can be very precise and very detailed, but it's global. Same with water and all the rest of these sort of things. So we try to pick where you can be very precise, but also global at the same time. So the Millennium Project was originally just an idea of how you create such a think tank. And we're suggesting it may become a trans institution. We're like an experimental run. And I think it would be nice if you could create a trans institution for water, trans institution for AIDS, trans institution for increasing IQ. You have a trans institution for anything. We just happen to have an experimental one for think tank. So it's shaped by UN organizations, influenced by them, shaped by them, the culture and so forth, but also by governments, by NGOs, by corporations, and by universities. So what gives it its form and its shape, its culture, its raison d'etre, its funding, its board of directors, etc., is these categories, different categories of institutions. Here's where we have our nodes around the world. The one in the middle, cyber, that goes anywhere. That's our first non-geographic node. And our cyber node's responsibility is to keep track of, and you all can get involved with this, called mpcolab.org. We have a guy that's keeping track of new forms of software, open source, free software, and putting them in new combinations that haven't been done before. So it's like he's not ready for prime time regular node, but he's feeding the rest of the system of new ideas. So these nodes identify the leading thinkers in their areas, the ones they can get a hold of, translate questionnaires, do the interviews in the cultural setting, and they also initiate their own work, and then they take the work of this and then present it back to their governments, the universities, and so forth. So this book is a textbook in some universities. It's used for government executive trainings and so forth. With these nodes, we have memorandums of understanding. And going back to the trans-institution approach again, some are with government entities, some are with private companies, some are with universities, and some are with NGOs. The relationship of the Millennium Project with the American Council for UNU and UNU gets confusing to people, so I'll very simply state the United Nations University is not a degree-granting institution. So if somebody says they got a PhD from UNU, you know they're a fraud. You know, let them talk for a while, get in deep over their head, and then tell them, no degree. It's collaborative research around the world. So like we answer the question, what did people eat today? And what's the nutritional content of that food? Now, FAO, World Health, USAID, they say this is what it ought to be. So what's the gap? All right? So UNU does this part of it, and the rest of the world does that part. So it's a little bit like the National Research Council. A lot of people don't know the National Research Council outside of Washington, D.C., but it does some very fundamental work on behalf of the Academies of Science and Engineering and so forth. Well, UNU does that, in a sense, for the UN as a whole. Now, I represent them here in Washington, D.C. under an NGO umbrella called the American Council for UNU. And in that role, I've been able to do the Millennium Project, which gives us flexibility we would not have under other systems. So it's a little bit like having your cake and eating it too. But we've been in business for over 10 years in operations, not including the feasibility studies, and my attitude, well, why not? Maybe a trans institution has to be invented through the cracked tissues of the institutional infrastructure of the world because it can't come through the normal systems possibly. These are our previous sponsors. Again, our income, we hope, comes from the different categories as well. And our current activities, we're working on global energy scenarios now. And futures research methodology, there's a version 2.0 is available. Hayato, are there any left in the back there? If anybody wants, they can either leave their name and their credit card or whatever, but we sell futures methodology. Got 27 chapters. It's the largest compendium of futures research methodology. So we do methods as well as content. And we're updating it now. Hopefully in 4 to 6 months it'll be done. We do the monthly environmental security report issues. We're in the process of putting together a futures dictionary encyclopedia. This is a monster project because it's not simply giving definitions. We want to have what the web links are, maybe some images, who came up with the term, a little bit more than dictionary, but a little less than encyclopedia, and vetting it through different cultures, because, the United States is not the only place that uses the word future. We're going to update in our scenario bibliography. I don't know if you know this, but we produce a annotated scenario bibliography, not a list of scenarios, but like paragraphs for each one. And there's over 550, maybe 600 scenario sets in the CD now. So if somebody said, give me all the views of humanity about the future, that's a good one-stop shop. And it's organized in terms of thematic areas as well as nation-state areas. And so each year we update what new scenarios have been done, and then we put that in there. Middle East peace scenarios were written through quite an imaginative process. I won't go into that in detail right now, but is now in the process of use as a discussion document in Israel and in the Gulf and in the Middle East. And it's stimulated some interesting conversations. You all know that sometimes scenarios can help a conversation happen, and some interesting conversations are now happening. We're fostering that continued thing. And there may be a meeting, by the way, in Cairo coming up with the first thing surfacing on this in about several months. We're in the process of extending the nation states that do State of the Future indexes. Egypt has asked for a formal process, and some parts of China are beginning in their local areas doing State of the Future indexes of certain provinces, and then they'll work it up the grassroots way. We'll continue to, if all goes well, update and improve global challenges and publish the 2006 version, but we haven't gotten there yet. We're in the process of getting ready to do a future women's study, and what we're doing is we think the largest compendium of women's issues research organizations, annotations, so to describe what they do. Now in the process of going through their stuff to say what research have you done and what are the answers that you have. So imagine 3 columns: the institute, the questions, and the answers. Because then we'll use that then to say, okay, what hasn't been done that ought to be done. And we're continuing our experiments in collaborative software. We put together a relational database and a weblog. Sounds like an obvious thing to do, but the first time I think we did that was for the Kuwait Oil Company last year. Because so weblog, you have one comment after another after comment, but you can't do relational, fields, search for fields. So what you do is you have a weblog where you're putting in your stuff, but then you have an option to also add it into fields. It's just another step. So then you can do your normal relational database and have commentary on it at the same time. This is the methods of 27 chapters of future source methodology. We'll probably add about 5 to 7 or 8 chapters in the next issue. And that's the Millennium Project. Questions? Yes, sir.
Barry, I'm just wondering what the role you would place on radical interventions. And I'm thinking about things like creativity, inventions, acts of God, pandemics, a myriad of things that could intervene here, and particularly in the context that if the next 15 years, the pace of change, creativity, innovation would be so great, won't that impact greatly on the thesis that you put forward that we can deal with the future in a longer term range? I mean, I understand there's problems in there, but could you comment on that?
There's about 20 questions wrapped up in that one simple question. Well, we are going to add a chapter in the methods on wildcards. John Peterson and another guy, Karl Heinz in Germany, put together a little thing on that, on how you would use those acts of gods or surprises or whatever, those what called one-term wildcards. And in there, they explain how one might use that. Now, the thing about doing the methods is we actually scratch our heads and say, well, what are we going to do about that method? So there'll be a feedback loop into our system. Secondly, second answer to that complex, multifold question is that we have developed, in that chart I showed you that led to the 15 challenges, in there they had all these little developments. There's hundreds of developments that are okay, and there's hundreds of developments that are not okay. Well, let's give us a database of developments, potential developments. I don't remember big acts of God, but in any case, there's a lot of developments in there. And we use those developments, and have, in a variety of ways. One of the ways we use them is running the State of the Future Index. We put in all those bizarre developments and see how that would affect. So you get a Monte Carlo spread. So when you look at the State of the Future, you'll see like a little spread of stuff. That spread is defined by running Monte Carlos on those developments. That's one way we do it. We have thought about and have not gotten around to doing it yet. Doing a study specifically on that. You know, because you have think tanks that have come up with wildcards, but it hasn't been sort of vetted on a global basis. What do we humanity think about those wildcards? And so what? We haven't done that. But we have been thinking about it and moving toward it, but we haven't done it yet. So those are some questions to it. And one of my hesitations is it sort of lets you know, I'm a little resistant to it. I'll tell you why. Although you got to take wildcards into account, but they have a magic that they can pull you in. It's like, well, gee, if we just do X, or if God just does Y, then I don't have to do anything. And it sort of lets us off the hook. And so I want to look at those wildcards, but I don't want to let us off the hook, because I don't think we can do that, afford to do that.
Yeah, I actually, one of the beauties of the Millennium Project methodology compared to traditional futures research is that it does provide a vehicle for what we can do to think about wildcards. So instead of having a preset form of 20 options that everybody checks the boxes on, you know, you're literally dredging the whole world to ask, okay, what are the variables that you think might come up that you guys are working on? And creativity is not just something that happens to us, it's something we do. And with a dialogue, putting together all the pieces, thinking about the big picture, it can become a vehicle for positive creativity, and if it surprises us, well, so much the better.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
You mentioned that the crime syndicates have more agile. They're more agile. How did you research their management model and determine they're more agile?
I haven't researched their management model. I've just looked at their footsteps. So I don't know how the animal's configured well, but I can see the footsteps. So I'm inferring from that. You can't, I mean, I go back to the example, you can't control the price of a commodity on a global basis daily. It's illegal without one whopper management system. And it's got to be agile because you got wars going on, you got new shipments that don't get through. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that can mess up a price, as you know. And they're managing it pretty well. So I'm inferring that. I don't know it. I'm inferring it.
And you're also inferring that there's a single central control?
No, I don't refer that. Just like there's not a single central control for the militaries either. But some people are more powerful than others. And sometimes they work in concert, and sometimes they don't. So I assume that. Yeah. Yes.
Are you involved at all? I understand there's a UN forum on key indicators that's going to reconvene in 2007, and there's also a burgeoning State of the USA Key National Indicator Initiative. Are you familiar with those, or would you like to be?
I run on a pretty serious information overload system. And I think I have a vague recollection of both of those. I may have responded, I may not have, I'm not sure. But I suppose I should. Yeah. Yes?
Was any attempt made to prioritize your 15 global challenges?
Oh, I'm glad you asked that question. Emphatically, no. Why? Can you tell me whether the brain is more important than the heart? But that's the deal. I mean, if we're talking about the human entity, the human organism, the human species, the family, whatever, it all matters. The bones are not more important than the nerves. The brain is not more important than the hips. Well, I suppose you can get along without hips. But in any case, as far as the systems are concerned, we don't do that. Each of the 15 challenges, one, there's the first conclusions that were interesting. One is that if you improve any one of those 15 challenges, you'll have a positive impact, to some degree, on the others. If you have a regression in any of the 15, it has a negative impact on the others. So it is a system in that sense. Two, it is also fractal in the sense that you can do as above, so below, the old mystic phrase. It works with this. You can have sustainable development for an individual, for a family, for a community, for a state, for a world, for an industry, for a network. So you can look at global solutions to water. How do we create more water with better desalination systems and so forth? But you're also very local in what you do about the water at the same time. So they're all global, local. They're all graded up. So you can actually do a matrix of the 15 challenges, and then what does the individual do? What does the family do? What does the community do? And the whole, and it becomes quite complex. Now, I didn't mention that in the CD-ROM, there is the longer descriptions of the challenges breaks those things down in terms of geographic regions. So what in Asia, China, India, so forth. And so we get into a little bit of that. But I'm glad you asked the question. No, we don't prioritize. As a matter of fact, one of my major complaints with the media and our swallowing the media is that they keep putting a microphone down our throats and saying, what is the most important problem? And then my colleague will say, well, you know, actually water isn't the most important problem because if I have enough energy over here, I can solve your water problem. And then we go back and forth, and then the credit rolls and the television show's over. Right? That's not smart. We have to say the world is complex, folks. It really is. You know, and we have a media giving us cotton candy most of the day. And we're dumbing ourselves down. We've got to get smarter. I mean, we're walking to a knowledge economy. We've got to get more sophisticated. And we just roll up our intellectual sleeves and say, hey, guess what? We can get more smart. We really can. We don't have to be fed this crap nonsense all the time. So it is 15 challenges. It may be 17. It may be 14. But the point is we shouldn't let people get away with forcing us to say, you're more important than you are. You know, it's just not going to work out. It is complex. And there's a strategic part in here that I get carried away with, obviously. And that is that when I hear people say, what I'm doing is more important than you're doing, you're dividing people. We need people to work on women's issues. We need people to work on global ethics. We need people to work on water. The idea of saying, you know, let's all do this or this is more important, it's silly. Go with the interests of people and just marshal it together like an orchestra. A trumpet should not be a violin. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
I'm really curious what you think about global employment. I'm particularly interested in sustainable livelihoods for people that, you know, in ways that produce tax revenues so that actually their communities could have education and
Right.
so on. And it seems to me that that's a big open question.
Yeah.
You know, the numbers, do we have enough?
Right.
Is there going to be work? How would you deal with this whole thing?
Right,
Can
okay.
you talk about that?
Yeah, I'll give you an example. And for some of my friends who have heard this before, I apologize, but I still like this one. Imagine a witch doctor in Malawi, Africa, who has a nephew who is at school and can speak and write English. For about $1 or so, they get into the main city to a cyber cafe, which does exist in Lilongwe. And they go to the cyber cafe and they plunk down a couple more dollars. Now, we're looking $3 at this point, which is within the range of the situation. Not great, but within the range of possible. And that witch doctor then has the son take out a Hotmail account at no cost, take out a GeoCities website at no cost. Because the cyber cafe is a little sophisticated, they got the little clicker with an image thing, and the son or the nephew puts in the witch doctor's face and says, put your credit card number here, your expiration date, and so forth, and I will answer your question within 1 week. Okay. A week later, they come back. How many questions do you think he might have gotten? 5, 6, 7, 10, 100? I don't know. But if he was charging $25, that's one whopping rate of return within 1 week by any business model you can come up with. Now, I say if a witch doctor in the middle of Kota, Malawi can take advantage of creating self-employment through the internet, then anybody on this earth can do it too. I mean, but the part of this is what is your unique contribution? You know, when you're a farmer, there's only a couple of ways to farm. There's not much uniqueness about it. When you work in a factory, there's more differentiation, but not that much more. And you didn't necessarily have to have all these knowledgeable people. But when you're doing a knowledge economy, where you are potentially having the global market revolve around your access codes, then it's smart. Your competitive advantage is knowing yourself and being you, your uniqueness. We haven't come to grips with that at all. Yeah.
Yeah, the history of what you were just presenting and the 24/7 computer and the future are very well described in 1954 by Teilhard de Chardin.
Yes.
The value of it that I found in rereading it is how he gets to it.
Yeah.
Because he gives it all the way back in history to the first little blob of life on the earth and carries it through and foresees the future. Now there's one issue, which I didn't realize the first time I read it, is that somewhere at the end of the book he says, maybe a million years.
Ah.
And
Yeah, a little
now
pessimistic,
we're
wasn't
finding
he?
out the acceleration. that-
Yeah. Yeah, well, of course, by saying maybe a million years, he covers his bets. He was a smart character.
In the 21st century, 50 years ago.
Yeah, yes, yes.
You mentioned, you were talking about employment. The same thing holds true, of course, for education and the
Yeah.
internet. And that, is that explored? And,
Yeah.
And the other thing I want to mention, Margaret Wheatley's book, Leadership in the New Science. Is that something that has influenced you or that you look to or do you know about? Because it talks about chaos theory and
Yeah.
patterns and all
Well, my friends in math and physics, I hope will forgive me, but we try to use the metaphors of chaos theory in the management of the Millennium Project. Think of the nodes as attractors.
I'm thinking of one of them right now. We did a study on this.
Well,
That the Russian
Go ahead,
node and the
yeah.
East European nodes were deep into it. In fact, there was someone high in the Russian Academy of Sciences who felt that chaos theory might be a very good way to describe the state of science in Russia in the last several years. And there was a lot of follow-up on that. But actually, of course, chaos theory is the tip of an iceberg in terms of nonlinear system dynamics, which is a very complex area.
when I say that I apply it a little bit in the management of the project, aside from taking the humor part and taking that humor seriously, it's also the idea of a system gets more complex, it breaks down, you have new organizational structures, right? So we have seen the idea of using the nodes, these things, in a sense, as attractors. If you go with the old idea of the pyramid hierarchical power system, then you have a network defeats a hierarchy, essentially. Now we have two or more networks, you have a node. Then as the nodes create their own interference patterns, so to speak, and so now we're starting to interlink in a lot of very interesting ways. The next planning committee meeting is going to be interesting. These create fields of play that don't exist in the normal world. And so in that sense, we're drawing on it from a little bit.
Should we be technical and reputable for a minute?
Why not?
Okay, chaos theory. Okay, one of the interesting questions is, how do you get real intelligence? How do you build systems that are intelligent? And can multiple agent or multiple actor systems be collectively intelligent? People are looking at this a lot in the field of manufacturing, where they're trying to come up with multi-agent systems that can effectively, optimally produce goods, coordinating factories all around the world. And there's some very interesting mathematics coming out of that effort. It turns out it is possible to develop intelligent agents which can do wonderful things, but if they're each operating independently, you get incremental progress, right. And there are two fundamental things that are not automatically in the structure, even if you do each agent right. And a crude way of naming those two things are imagination and creativity. And where those things come from is you have to be able to imagine scenarios for the whole global system, and you have to talk about escaping from local minima, getting out of the box. It's called a convexity problem. And those are two areas where you need a kind of integrated global thinking mechanism somewhere, right, in order to avoid getting stuck in a trap. And so I guess this is a global thinking mechanism.
Hopefully.
Yeah, it's an effort.
Yeah, if you'll pardon a simplistic question, on the span of human life, some people would say that if one were to divide humanity's history into two sections, the first section would be before and the second would be after human beings gained the capability of extending the maximum possible human lifespan. Depending on who you talk to, different people will tell you that we're either on the cusp of this, and others will say we're very far from it. Some people say that young people today may be within the escape velocity for highly extended human lifespan.
Right.
That is to say that during the time that they have left in their lifetimes, discovery is sufficient to further extend their lifetimes,
right,
being made and so forth.
Right.
Have you addressed this issue at all? If not,
well, we discussed it a bit in several locations. One in the science and technology area, challenge there in the CD-ROM, the detail part. There's a lot going on in life extension research that was not going on 20 years ago. Secondly, discussed it a bit in the demographics, because right now, if you take a look at UN forecasts, and for those of you that don't know this, the UN forecasts, they change every so often. If you do the history of UN forecasts on projections on life extension, all that sort of stuff, and how long people go. By the way, on your way out, you can buy a copy of The State of the Future. What you can do is you take the bottom forecasts, the lower, like the high, middle, and low. You take a low. Over the years, it tended to be more accurate as a generalization than the middle or the high. Now, if I take a look at the low forecast out to 2,100 right now, it's 5.5 billion. In other words, it's 1 billion fewer people at the turn of the next century than we have today. Eye-opener? All right? Why? Fertility rates are going crashing, all right? And the rich got old and can use their rich money to handle this aging thing, but the poor are getting older also, but they didn't get rich yet. So they've got a humongous problem coming up with the aging deal. Now, it could very well be that that's not what's going to happen. There's a lot of aging research that can make people think that it is not impossible for a pretty definite, indefinite, or a pretty indefinite life expectancy, which could therefore make the world work. Because right now, if you have a big, massive bell curve, you have population go way up to 2050 or so, and starts to fall, and then falls off fast, it's pretty hard to run a system like that. But if you have the age continue, then a lot of this knowledge and education you're keeping in your civilization, so to speak. I mean, if Einstein was really around, we might have had some answers to some of those chaotic things. Now, telomeres. I didn't know about telomeres 20 years ago. Did anybody know about telomeres 20 years ago? The ends of the DNAs are supposed to help the rolling out of RNA work, right? We didn't know about stem cells being able to, I think it was just last year, they took an adult stem cell, regressed it, to act as if it were embryonic, more differentiated. If that's the case, then I can clone that, fill up the thing, and shoot it into various parts of my body, huh? Those are just two, and there's a lot more than that. So I think it is irresponsible if serious futurists don't take the idea of life extension into account. We don't know the truth of the future, but we can know plausible alternative futures. And serious life extension, going off indefinitely, is a plausible alternative future that you can now point to with more data today than you could 20 years ago.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes?
Environmental security is one of the major areas that you raised as a challenge, but the performance in being able to approach sustainable development seems to be going in the opposite direction. We hear that a lot. Why isn't the market economy responding to the challenge of sustainable development? And what do you see as being the driver or the major drivers to turn that trend around?
You want to ask an easier question? For those who are watching, I know. Well, there's a lot of answers. I don't have the answer. The question for the viewers was how come the sort of the environmental security issue is deteriorating rather than improving. The global situation in many indicators are going down. Some indicators are improving, but a lot of the serious ones are going down. One is that I think it's a true statement that you have lip service before you have action. So we've got a lot of lip service on sustainable development. And you can go anywhere in the world and somebody's going to say, well, that's not sustainable development. That is sustainable development. There are now accounting firms that will audit a company in terms of sustainable development, which gives them a competitive advantage going to China and India. Labeling, self-organized, is going quickly. One of the things that we concluded in the science technology study was you can't do universal labeling and all the rest of that sort of laws until you get some definitions done. We're still waiting for those to get done in some measurable way. There are many things today that are like that one ought to do co-energy generation. I remember suggesting this in Vermont in 1971, and it was considered to be a not a proper thing to do. And now, of course, you do cogeneration. Are you dumb? You know, so a lot of environmental, I can feel the ship turn. That's why I showed you that little graph of the environmental treaties changing the number. It's shifting. The world is shifting. Is it shifting fast enough? I honestly don't know. I'd like to think we could speed it up. I think that the environmental movement that took on nuclear energy and flattened out that growth in early 70s, the growth of nuclear energy around the world, notwithstanding the recent Finland decision, had a simple target. Fossil fuel industry and so forth is a far more diverse target, very difficult. Will they begin to take that on? I think it's very much of a possibility. I did talk with an unnamed oil company, and was told that, I said, have you ever had any attacks on your systems, environmental attacks? And they said something like, some large, I don't remember what the number was right now, but the number was large enough my teeth rolled out. I said, but I never heard anything about this. So apparently there are some things, and it's not just UN, I mean, it's worldwide. It's shifting. Is it shifting? You know, can we get it to shift faster? Yeah, read some of the stuff in the book. But we have to know where we're winning and where we're losing. It's important to reinforce where we're winning. And when somebody says nonsense, I think it's very useful. And when I hear somebody say, well, I don't know about this global warming stuff, I say, I'm sorry. You haven't read the homework. You haven't done your homework. You just haven't read the stuff. You know? And people say, well, the scientists have a range of opinion. Yeah, they got a range of opinion on the impact. That's a completely different question. So first you got to, and I told the Academy of Sciences at a meeting, and they actually published it, and it still didn't make a difference. It said, look, this is a real phenomenon. Let's get that understood first. Now, the range of impact, that's a different issue. And the Academy of Science, one of their papers said almost exactly that verbatim in the first paragraph. I mean, they got it right. And what difference? And you still have people running around? But, by the way, mostly only in this town. I mean, I'm overseas a lot. And I'm dealing with a policy crowd, and they're all going like, what is with America? You know, international meetings, before they had the formal meetings, sometimes off to the side. You know what the issue is? What are we going to do about America?
Yeah, although with CO2, in all fairness, I'm not representing the U.S. government here, even though I work with it. But sometimes the U.S. government does get a bad rap. I think, you're saying lip service is easy.
But it's important. You begin with lip service.
And next easiest is spending lots of money on your friends that accomplishes nothing. And I think the real problem is that I don't think there is a single, in my personal opinion is, I don't think there's a single country on this earth that is doing any better than 5% effectiveness in terms of, real required change towards sustainability per dollar of investment in the critical areas like energy environment. And, you go to these cocktail parties where people say, I'm better than the U.S., we're great, we have these quotas. And then you look, what are these quotas? Well, they're a bunch of people who shake hands and agree that they're going to have targets. But what are they doing? Well, they're shaking hands and they're going to parties. But in terms of the underlying technologies that you need, if you want to cut CO2 by a factor of 3 or 4, you can't do it with a few cocktail parties. That won't do it. You have to have fundamental changes in technology. And there are people I know who are world-class social scientists who will say, that's easy, just put a carbon tax on, okay? But I used to work at the Department of Energy. If you have a brute force carbon tax, most of what happens is people get very confused and upset. And you probably lose more effort from people running around in circles than you benefit in terms of the specific kinds of aggressive new technologies that could really reduce the carbon dioxide. There are specific technologies, but the problem is there's a certain level of political discourse where they just don't get into that kind of detail. And if the solution lies in connecting the details and your information mechanisms exclude the details, you're in trouble. I heard Senator McCain just a couple weeks ago when they were planning their 2008 meeting, and he was complaining. He said there are a lot of big companies in the U.S. that could go bankrupt if we don't solve problems A, B, and C. And their lobbyists come to our office, and those problems are on their list, along with 40 other things. And the only thing they have time to talk about is tax breaks and subsidies. And the problem is that we don't have time for the conversation we really need. At least that's what he said.
One of the things that Paul sort of rattled my chain about, and we want to take it the next step, and as a matter of fact, Hayato Kobayashi in the background did a paper on this. At that time, one of the best overviews. Even got it published in Technological Forecasting or Foresight, one of those journals. And what I'd like to do is take it the next step, is have column A is a listing all of the carbon sequestration possibilities, no matter how far out. I don't care. Just list them all. Let's get them all down there. Then the second column, what is the science that we know? And I mean, what's the laboratory's name, rank, serial number, or if there's several working, I want to know exactly what is the state of what we know. Not what we're conjecturing, what do we know? Get that nailed down in the second column. And then the third column is what are the policy options to do those things? So then you're going to have a sheet where we, humanity, can decide together. Now, the Global Environmental Facility of World Bank, UN Environment Program, and UNDP did fund an outfit to do something like that in Paris. After a year of operation,